School is great at teaching you rules, formulas, and frameworks, but the top thinkers play a completely different game. Over my more than 12 years as both a peer-reviewed academic and an educator, I've witnessed firsthand how missing this component destroys innovation and even people's careers. And so in this video, I'm going to teach you not only the 3 aspects of your mind you have to train in order to be a top performer in your field, but also a system you can use to train these daily. So let's dive into the first aspect of your mind you have to train: the algorithmic mind. In the book Thinking Fast and Slow by the renowned psychologist Daniel Kahneman, Kahneman establishes what is now a well-established theory on what he calls the 2 systems of the mind. System 1 is fast, automatic, and intuitive. For instance, think of when you're walking on a rocky trail. You don't calculate every step you take. Your mind does the calculation automatically and provides you with a mostly accurate gut feeling of where and how to place your feet as you're walking on that trail so you won't get hurt. System 2, however, is slow, analytical, and deliberate. For instance, think of doing a math problem or even simply calculating a tip in your head. Well, simply put, it's this system, System 2, that school helps you train. But as the cognitive scientist Keith Stanovich has pointed out, training this system simply isn't enough. You see, Stanovich agrees that these 2 systems exist, but what school overlooks and fails to train is a 3rd system, seemingly hiding within System 2. As he argues, on the basis of decades of research, not only is there a System 1, what he calls the autonomous mind, but also there are in fact 2 parts of the mind that make up System 2, what he calls the algorithmic mind and the reflective mind. The algorithmic mind is exactly what we already described: your ability to do a math problem, calculate a tip, or summarize a text. The reflective mind, however, that is what we could consider critical thinking ability. And it's this critical thinking ability that is what is most missing from school teaching. As the cognitive scientist Diane Halpern has pointed out, the evidence is clear. We can get good gains in critical thinking when teachers deliberately teach for critical thinking. But what if teachers don't? Do students become better thinkers as a routine part of getting a good education? In fact, most do not. You see, you likely haven't been taught to train this part of your mind, but we'll come to see shortly why training it in a very specific way helps you massively outperform everyone around you. For now, however, we do have to acknowledge something that school does get right, and that is training the algorithmic mind. The famous artist Pablo Picasso once said, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist." The reflective mind, as we'll see, helps us understand when, how, and why to break the rules. But the reality remains. You still do have to learn the rules first in order to break them. So before we learn how to break the rules by developing our reflective mind, let's explore how to train this rule-following mechanism: the algorithmic mind. You see, I do a lot of private teaching, not only for college entrance exams, but also for essay writing, statistics, neuroscience, economics, you name it. In order to get students to understand and memorize basic concepts needed for these topics and others, I have students engage in 3 main activities that apply to virtually any topic you could be learning. 1, diagnose; 2, target; and 3, reassess. Let's start with number 1 here. First, diagnose where you are. Don't just dive into another chapter or test blindly. Figure out what you already know and where you're actually weak. That's your starting point. Number 2 here is to then target those weak spots directly. If you struggle with a specific concept, say running an ANOVA test in statistics or writing clear transitions in an essay, isolate that one skill and train it deliberately. Don't waste time retaking full tests or rewriting entire essays until you've actually improved this component skill. Once you've made progress, start blending your strong and weak areas together, what psychologists call interleaved practice. This trains your brain to switch between different types of problems and build real cognitive stamina. Finally, proceed to step 3. Reassess. Now is when you take a full test or write another essay, because you'll have a far more accurate assessment of your overall growth. From there, you simply repeat the cycle. This loop is one of the most powerful ways to build a skill in any domain. But notice what it really does. It trains you to follow rules more efficiently. It builds precision and fluency, but it doesn't yet teach you when to break those rules. And that's where the second system we've been alluding to comes in: the reflective mind. You see, one subject I've taught for over a decade now is college test preparation. Everything from SAT to ACT to SSAT, ISCE, APs, the whole alphabet soup. So I have knowledge firsthand that these tests, like school, effectively bypass your reflective mind and therefore your critical thinking ability altogether. But how could that possibly be the case? Well, you see, there are really only so many questions you can encounter on any of these tests. And so in order to get really good at these, you have to do what I just taught you with respect to the algorithmic mind. You have to diagnose, target, and reassess. And you simply have to do it enough until you have effectively trained your autonomous mind to answer automatically, essentially without thinking. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take this question as an example. Whether or not you know how to find the answer to this question, it doesn't matter. However, it's a brute fact that if I sat with you and had you do 100 of this type of question and showed you every step you need to take to solve it again and again, and then had you repeat it again and again, you would most definitely be able to solve the 101st question of this type all by yourself. In other words, you will have effectively trained your autonomous mind to see the constant in this question, as well as certain wording in the problem, and then you would automatically proceed to use the discriminant to solve it. And in fact, you would no longer need to think. And so the way you'd ace this test would ultimately, and ironically, be by training yourself to stop thinking. But don't you feel like there's something wrong with this? I mean, as Halpern and others have pointed out, if all we're doing is learning the rules, frameworks, and formulas and learning how to iteratively apply them to certain patterns we learn, is that really building our thinking ability? In fact, how many people do you know who are extremely intelligent, yet who cannot think in dynamic and innovative ways? For instance, I've met statisticians who are great at running statistical tests, but then when we discuss, for instance, the ontological status of latent variables or the epistemic assumptions behind maximum likelihood estimation methods, they become like a deer in headlights. They've become so dependent only on their algorithmic rule-following mind that even one small step outside of what they've learned is almost incomprehensible to them. And so how can we engage and train our reflective mind in order to avoid this? Well, whenever I teach anything, test prep included, I always try to get students to challenge the material and keep asking, why? I almost never explain why the answer they gave is wrong. Instead, I have them explain to me why they believe their answer is right and have them defend it. But why not just explain it? Well, you see, when someone explains an answer to you, they're teaching you what to think. This is the answer and this is why. Memorize the principle here. Boring. And not only boring, you're only teaching your algorithmic mind to be more algorithmic, more rule following. Instead, when someone asks you to defend your answer, you have to activate your reflective mind. You have to start asking yourself questions such as, what is the rule or pattern here? Does my conclusion follow from my premises? Are there other possible methods or techniques I could use to solve this? Why is this the rule anyway? And why should I accept it? But you see, here's the magic. You don't have to have someone else ask you these questions. You can ask yourself these questions. Going back to our friend Picasso for a moment, this is what he meant by breaking the rules. You see, all good artists follow the rules, but the great ones break them. All good musical composers follow good technique and theory, but the great ones challenge the accepted technique. Good scientists follow the right procedures and rules, but great scientists ask, what evidence would I need in order to prove this hypothesis wrong? And is this the only way we can look at this problem, or is there yet another way we can examine it? In fact, to make any kind of scientific innovation at all, you have to have guts. You have to essentially say, virtually all scientists accept this hypothesis, but I'm going to show they're all wrong. And so how can you train yourself to think this way consistently, finding solutions to complex problems where others can't, and ultimately learning topics more deeply than others? Well, I have an entire video outlining some specific methods, but one method that is both extraordinarily simple yet extraordinarily effective is to use this template, a template that Halpern has put together in her book, Thought and Knowledge, an introduction to critical thinking. This template provides you a way to challenge the assumption underlying any rules, frameworks, or principles, and not only in academic contexts. Instead, this is also something practical you can use every single day. So for instance, let's say you're a manager deciding whether to let your team work fully remotely. Most people would immediately take a side. Of course, remote work is better, or of course it hurts productivity, but that kind of automatic judgment comes from your autonomous mind, the part that reacts quickly and confidently based on habit, emotion, or bias. Just like in our test prep example, whatever conclusion you make is based on whatever rule you've already accepted and been taught to follow. But let's break this habit. What I want you to do instead is to engage your reflective mind here. On one side of this template, we have the conclusion: we should allow employees to work fully remotely. The reasons that support this might be it increases productivity by removing commute fatigue and constant interruptions. It expands access to global talent and lowers costs. But now, and this is where reflective learning starts, we force ourselves to articulate the reasons against that very same conclusion. For instance, it can weaken social cohesion and spontaneous collaboration. It makes onboarding and mentoring junior staff much harder. And then we flip it. The opposite conclusion: we should not allow employees to work fully remotely. Reasons for that might be some of what you see here. But let's notice something interesting about this situation, as well as nearly all life situations. Most, if not all, of these reasons rely on certain assumptions that most people never notice. You see, it's not enough to simply list these out, give yourself a pat on the back for doing so, and then choose whatever intuitively seems like the best reasons. No, to make a decision here or come up with a solution relies on two further types of thinking. One, descriptive thinking, and two, normative thinking. And I cover these types of thinking more extensively in my free critical thinking masterclass, which you can find in the pinned comment below. For instance, before we make a decision, we have to analyze the evidence for each claim. After all, they all sound plausible, but as I often teach my students, there's a big difference between what's simply plausible and what actually has evidence to support it. And that's a distinction nearly all of us overlook regularly. For instance, when was the last time someone cut you off in traffic and you concluded that it's because they're inconsiderate? Well, that's plausible, but you don't really have any evidence about their motivations or reasons, do you? And so we now have to carefully apply standards of evidence, not mere plausibility, to each statement. But now let's say you confirm that all of these claims are supported by good evidence. What do you do then? Well, at that point, you'll now need to judge the relative importance of each reason. And this is where normative thinking comes in, or in other words, the analysis of value judgments. For instance, how important is employee productivity versus the trust and creativity in-person environments create? Is expanding access to global talent and lowering costs more important than this trust and creativity? Well, you need some method of evaluating these value judgments. In other words, you need what's called a value theory, especially for when there are conflicts of values, as there almost always are. You see, most people never explicitly think about these two forms of thinking, and it's why seemingly very intelligent people end up not only making very dumb decisions, but also end up learning at a very shallow level. And so can you now see why this reflective level is so important? Well, it's important because although your algorithmic mind is most reflective of your IQ, simply having a high IQ won't save you from mediocrity. Simply having high IQ won't allow you to learn deeply. Instead, it will help you become good at following a standard procedure. Yet in today's world, simply following standard procedures isn't adequate to help you gain true mastery. For that, you have to learn how to break the rules. For that, you have to learn how to question traditional thinking. For that, you need to hone your critical thinking ability. And fortunately, I have an entire video on how to further develop your critical thinking that you can watch